So sometimes being a Ned can be quite challenging, and it can be a lonely role, particularly if you think differently to others on your board. So we've created the opportunity for you to share your challenges anonymously. We've called it Dear Dynamic Boards. So here's the first challenge that we've received. Dear Dynamic Boards, one of the executive directors is clever, charismatic, and absolutely on top of their game. The rest of the board think they are great and are slightly in awe. However, the result is that whenever I put forwards even slightly challenging questions, the response is, well, it's very complicated. And the rest of the board nod and smile and move on. I've raised it with the chair, but to no avail. Mountain out of a molehill? So thank you to whoever sent this through. We've got some experienced board members here with us to talk this through. I'll do quick introductions and then we'll dive in. So we've got Susan Hooper. Susan describes herself as a stubbornly optimistic environmentalist. She has had non-exec director roles with 18 boards, some of those as chair as well. Her current roles include Carbon Cap, Moonpig and Uber. She's one of the founding directors of Chapter Zero, and if you haven't heard of Chapter Zero yet, do check it out. They provide helpful programs to equip non-execs to consider the impact their organisations have on the climate. Next, Ellie Southwood. Ellie currently serves on boards of 2 housing associations, one as a non-exec, the other as a chair. She was previously chair of the RNIB, and she saw the organisation through a period of structural deficit, a statutory inquiry and a change of CEO. Her board career is really only just getting started, but she's already witnessed governance challenges many of us will take a whole career to experience. And last but not least, Patrick Dunne. Patrick is an experienced chair in the business and social sectors and spent the bulk of his career with FTSE 100 private equity investor 3i Group plc. He shares a wealth of his reflections on what makes boards function well or not in his award-winning book called Boards. No one else has got that name yet. I'm Sarah. I'm CEO of Dynamic Boards, and I'm also a non-exec myself. I've been on 4 boards. At Dynamic Boards, we advertise about 100 non-exec roles at any one time. It's totally free to access. So if you're looking for new board members, we can do targeted advertising to get your board role in front of those who meet your brief. And if you're thinking about becoming a non-exec, then please do sign up and have a look. So to kick us off, Susan, between the 18 boards, have you experienced anything like this?
I have, especially on sustainability, and it is the nature. Unfortunately, that response is correct. It is complicated, but that is not an excuse for inaction. And when things are complex, very simply, you break them down into bite-sized chunks and deal with them. But what you can't do is walk away from having action. So I would myself, work. I think it's disappointing that the chair has had that response, but you know what? Life is full of disappointments, and it's about how you get over that and just never let up. I think tenacity is incredibly important in a moment like that, and it's not about nagging or whining. It's about suggesting, like, why don't we break that down then? So, what are the priorities? What are the knowns? What are the unknowns? And let's deal with something such that we can actually move the dial, because, just accepting that it's complicated is sort of saying, in 3 years from now, I'm probably not going to be here and it's not my accountability. And I feel very firmly this is on my watch. We have to deal with the difficult issues now in order to achieve the targets that we're setting in the future. I don't know if that's
a helpful start. Thank you, Susan. So tenacity being key to being a non-exec. Ellie, what would you do if a chair didn't listen to a challenge you brought forward?
Well, I think what's interesting about this question, and I suspect there are plenty of non-execs watching who are thinking, oh yeah, I feel like this happens sometimes, because sometimes it is kind of implicit when you ask a question, and sometimes it's explicit, isn't it? Sometimes you just get the sense that you've asked something that isn't welcome, there isn't time for. But it's interesting that the questionnaire suggests that the exec is on top of their game, because for all executives in all organisations, governance and making sure that a board understands what it needs to is absolutely part of their role. And I think I would probably suggest that there might be, depending on personalities around the table, there might be a sort of curious, almost playful way to approach it, rather than getting into a kind of situation where you're continually asking these questions and continually not getting anywhere with them, is to, you know, sort of say, I hear that it's complicated, and that's the nature of our business, and it is part of my role to really understand that. So could we maybe spend a bit of time one-on-one so that I really understand it? And the message that will send to the executive is that this is not going away. And if that doesn't work, then perhaps it's time to have a chat with the chief executive, because depending on who your regulator is or who your stakeholders are, we asked, but we're told it was too complicated, I'm afraid won't go very far in terms of, demonstrating you have done all that is reasonable to find out what it is you should know about as a board. And I just think an encouragement not to sort of break the bonhomie, because certainly on charity boards, I've found that it's not wanting to kind of be the person who says, I appreciate, Chair, that we're short of time, but this really is important. Can we find another way to make sure we've all got a grasp of this?
I think Ellie and Susan have sort of more or less nailed it. But the other things that I'd add is, I think the fundamental issue here is probably the chair, and actually not having a culture of constructive challenge, and not really appreciating the benefit of that. So often we sort of focus on the person in front of us, the person who's patronizing us in the way that this person seems to have done. It obviously doesn't sound like the chief executive, because they're described as an executive director. So there should be the opportunity to give the CEO feedback on the executive director at some point. But also, I'd say issues like this are often best dealt with outside of formal board meetings. They're often better dealt with a coffee, with a sort of informal setting, and just being clear about, this isn't really kind of the way it's supposed to be. This isn't really the most productive thing for the board, and it will impact performance in the end. I've always thought, I always liked Warren Bennis's description of power, which is the ability to convert vision into reality. And in these situations, it's often, you often personalize it and you often take it on board view, but actually it's the other person's problem really, rather than yours. So, I mean, I remember once in one situation, I sort of offered to chair the NomCom, and that dramatically changed the relationship with the person who was doing this, because they thought that I might be eventually responsible for, the CEO selection. So they shifted. So sometimes people realize that. I think the behavior of, and I'd call out the behavior of, it's very complicated. That's just that's a great opportunity, I think. So I think they've made a mistake there. So I would say, well, I appreciate that, but you must have a concern on something, and probably that's around the consequences of following this action for a particular group of stakeholders. So often I found it say, well, I accept that's complex, but let's just take this particular stakeholder group. Could you just run me through what the consequences are for them and what you anticipate their reaction to be, and how that will play out. So I'd kind of take a kind of they've got a problem rather than I've got a problem approach, and also think about where the power lies. And fundamentally, if the chair isn't dealing with this, there's probably a load of other things that aren't being done properly. This is probably a symptom rather than a cause type thing. So I'd actually reflect on what else is not quite right. And so when I have my next chat with the chair, I might actually have a bundle of things which might change the dynamic between us, because they're probably not putting the work in. This is a sloppy, lazy type chair approach, will be my view. This
is a really good example of groupthink, where, and my sense, adding to what you just said, Patrick, is that it's very complicated, or it's very complex, and everyone nods means they don't know what they're talking about, and they've just been given a way out of addressing it by the person who's meant to know, saying it's very complicated. And that is one of the hardest situations in my mind for a non-exec, to sit back and think, well, I know it's important, and although I don't necessarily know what the answer is, I know that I'm accountable for making sure that the answer is going to be given to us, so that we understand that the company is on safe ground, so to speak. And it is such, when you hear everyone agreeing with a sentence like that, it actually means to me that you're right and that you need to continue to prod. And it's one of the easiest ways to create bad decisions is to assume that because everyone else has agreed with it, they must know better, they must be okay, they're right. And it's normally an easy way out for other board members who may not have the same understanding or point of view. So when you hear something like that, it's not to give up. I think, we've given lots of different examples about ways you can deal with it, but just beware of groupthink. It's the others on the board don't necessarily hold the answer, and you shouldn't rely on their agreeing to that statement as being assurance that it's okay.
Yeah, and you can probably see I've often found, my grandma told me this great thing, which was that it's really important to listen to what people say, but more important to listen to what they think. And usually I found when I'm sitting around the board table and I'm having that sort of thought, there's someone else as well. And just by scanning the room, you can see, and you might say, well, actually, I'm really interested to know what Ellie thinks. So you might sort of shift it and then have an ally. Of course, if Ellie says, yeah, it's fine, then you've blown it. But, if you know Ellie well, you'll know when she's got a different look on her face too.
Yeah. It's complicated. It is quite a worrying response, particularly because few things around a board table are impenetrable. I mean, if you work for an organization with an organization that deals in highly technical information, that's one thing, but that doesn't mean the content of board discussion should in any way reflect that. So I think there's probably a bit of a thought here about, does the executive really understand what the role of the board is? And it might just be that there's a fundamental misunderstanding here, that they think it's their job to kind of brief the board as if the board were going to need to kind of explain the issue or go into great levels of technical minutiae on something. Board needs to have the data it needs to have to make great decisions. And I wonder whether there's a misalignment there at the moment.
I always make the analogy of, you sometimes have to be the tallest poppy in the field, and the tallest poppy always is the one that gets your head cut off, and you have to actually just feel comfortable with that happening every now and then. If the issue's important enough. And in fact, I mentioned it before, it's it is our responsibility to make sure it's done. So trust your gut, be prepared to have the poppy head cut off. It always grows back.
And there's something quite liberating, isn't there? I mean,
what about having your head chopped off?
There are a couple of situations where I've sort of sat there and thought, would I resign over this? Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
And so if that's the worst possible outcome, if it's that important, you just think, well, what's to lose? I'd rather look back and think, it's a shame we had to part, than, oh God, I wish I'd said something before the regulator came in and asked me why I didn't know.
Well, you've only got one reputation.
Yeah, exactly. It's your reputation.
That's right.
I think you need to trust your gut a lot as well. If you sense that it doesn't make sense, or that you're not going to be able to feel comfortable with the outcome, you just can't let go of that. And I have so many examples in my past, which I'd love to rewind the video to and change, and just say, not take the assurance that everyone else says, oh yeah, it's too complicated, we can deal with it, but actually say, no, I've done this stuff before. I need to understand that. I'm not stupid. I know that now after 50 years of working, that I'm not stupid. It's not a matter of my intelligence. Something's not right here, and I need to continue. So it's about trusting your gut, and not, Patrick was mentioning too, it's not worrying about looking or feeling stupid.
Absolutely.
You most likely aren't.
And the chances are somebody who can't explain something to an 11-year-old perhaps doesn't understand it as well themselves as they'd like to give the impression that they do.
Yeah.
I think it comes back to tenacity. It's like, you're not there as a non-exec to solve the problem. You're there to make sure that the work is being done to solve the problem. And you need to have that assurance. And if you don't, it's your responsibility if something happens. So you just can't let go. And I think we've heard lots of different ways that you can do it other than confrontation in the boardroom. But it is the accountability. It's a really important role, a non-exec. You know, you can't do it yourself, but you have to make sure it's done. And if you're not confident that it's being done, you can't let go.
I agree entirely. I mean, I've had a situation where, you know, I've had to actually say, you know, well, I'm not comfortable supporting this until I understand it.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
I agree it's complex. So, you know, humour me and talk me through it.
Yeah.
And they've more or less got to say you're stupid, and we can't be bothered to ignore that. I think the other thing that's quite interesting is, if he's like that with you, he's probably even more like that with other execs, or he or she is dim and not realizing that, you know, non-execs can influence outcomes of future appointments. So the person's demonstrating a naivety and combining arrogance and ignorance. And so one of the things that I would look to do is sort of befriend that person in a way, and, you know, give them some sort of good counsel as well at the same time. I think, you know, in any conflict situation, you can compete, collaborate, compromise, avoid or accommodate. And you know, competing is sort of awkward, particularly if you're the sort of wise non-exec who's supposed to be calm. So you need to find another route, really, don't you?
Yeah, it's so interesting, because the behaviour that's described looks like trust on the surface, and actually is an example of a profound lack of trust. Because if trust really did exist, then those questions would be met with the understanding of, you know, good intent on all sides. And I think that's right, almost making an ally of that person, demonstrating to them that you are in fact their ally, and in fact it's in everybody's interest that those constructive challenge conversations can happen. Otherwise you can't evidence that either of you really is doing your job.
And you should look at this as an opportunity. And actually, you know, it's one of the fun bits of the job, isn't it? Turning people who perhaps dismiss whatever experience you've had before into people who will value it, and you can make a contribution and influence outcomes. So I think I'd view it as a sort of fun opportunity rather than a deep angst challenge. Brilliant.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to all three of you. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Patrick. I hope that's given you some sort of thoughts and ideas to this anonymous non-exec director who has this challenge. It's a fun opportunity, and I think we'll pull together some of those tips into a blog, so you've got a sense of sort of things you might be able to work through. But I think that big message from Susan on tenacity, it is the role of a non-exec to get answers and assurance where you need it. So this isn't something that you're making a mountain out of a molehill with. This is something that you need to address. So I hope this has been helpful. If you're watching this and you think, actually, on my board, I've got a totally different challenge, then we've got a link to submit a challenge below. And we'd love to hear from you. So thank you all and have a good day.